welcome to this day-long really symposium and conference on mass incarceration, the death penalty, criminal justice reform. Welcome to this day-long event and real conference that's been organized by Erin Kelly, who's the chair of the philosophy department, with the help of the Institute for Global Leadership, IGL, and also with the help for the Center of the Study of Race and Democracy, which I'm founding director. I want to thank Erin for organizing this. Sherm Kelly, who's not here now, Sister Helen Prejean, who's here and is going to be our keynote this evening. You can stand up. And also Teresa Sullivan, who's the program coordinator at the center, the CSRD, you can stand up, and Alyssa Bowling, who's our CSRD worker, who really helped publicize this event. Today, we have a great panel here with really three key activists and participants and scholars in this movement for really social justice, criminal justice reform, transformation, ending the death penalty, but ending mass incarceration, structural racism, racial and economic gender injustice. This panel is called Mass Incarceration and the Death Penalty, and we're going to have some comments and words from several different panelists. Sabrina Butler is going to be first, and I'll read bios of each, who's really undergone her own battles with the criminal justice system and is one of the exonerees on our panel. Laurence Ralph, who's an assistant professor of anthropology and African American studies, who's written really a wonderful book called Renegade Dreams, which looks at gang violence and disability in Chicago, is going to be speaking. And David J. Harris, who's at the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute at Harvard, who's a scholar, activist, Boston civil rights, real icon, and somebody who everybody sees around this city fighting for social, political, racial justice, really at the grassroots level, but connecting the grassroots level to institutions, because we need to do both. Sometimes people say we shouldn't be connected to these elite institutions like Harvard or Tufts, but if we utilize those institutions to leverage social justice and racial, economic, and gender justice, then those institutions are serving positive purposes. And certainly I think David Harris's career and the career of somebody like Charles Ogletree is a testament to that necessary conjuncture between being at the grassroots and being with local people and connecting to institutions. So I want to introduce Sabrina Butler. Sabrina Butler was a Mississippi teenager who was convicted of murder and child abuse in the death of her 9-month-old son, Walter. She was later exonerated of all wrongdoing. She's the only woman in the United States exonerated from death row. On April 12, 1989, as a teenage mother, Sabrina rushed Walter to the hospital after he suddenly stopped breathing. Doctors had attempted to resuscitate her child for only 30 minutes, but failed, and Sabrina's baby died the next day. The very day of her son's death, Sabrina was arrested for child abuse due to the bruises left by her resuscitation attempts. Sabrina's murder trial commenced in March of 1990. At the trial, prosecutors sought to prove that Sabrina's account of the events leading to her son's death were false and that she had inflicted the fatal wounds intentionally. Sabrina did not testify at her trial and was convicted of both murder and child abuse, becoming the only woman on Mississippi's death row at the time. Following her conviction, Sabrina filed an appeal with the Supreme Court of Mississippi. The courts reversed and remanded her convictions in August of 1992, declaring that the prosecution had failed to prove that the incident was anything more than an accident. In 1995, Sabrina's case went to retrial. At the retrial, one of Sabrina's neighbors had come forward with evidence that corroborated her account that the injuries to her son occurred during the course of an unsuccessful attempt to administer CPR. In addition, the medical examiner charged his opinion about Walter's cause of death, which he now believed occurred due to kidney malady. On December 17, 1995, Sabrina was exonerated after spending more than 5 years in prison and 33 months on death row. Today, Sabrina still lives in the same town where she was convicted with her husband Joe Porter and 3 children. She speaks as often as she can to the public and media about her story, and has recently published a memoir, The Sabrina Butler Story, that you can order on the website sabrinabutler.webs, but really witnesstoinnocence.org you can order. So without further ado, Sabrina Butler.
Well, he kind of told the story. Thank you. Thank you. In 1989, like he said, I was only 17 and a half. And my mistake was leaving my son at the house by himself. And I went jogging. When I came back, he wasn't breathing. So I didn't know what to do. I panicked. And I picked him up and ran outside to try to get somebody to help me. The lady next door to me said, my kid's in the bed, I don't have time. So she closed the door in my face. I had to go downstairs, and some lady on the end came and she grabbed my baby. And she took me in and started CPR first. Well, I finally got somebody to take me, to the hospital. When I went back in to get him, she told me to press in the stomach, hold his nose, and blow in the mouth. She didn't tell me right. I applied adult CPR to a 9-month-old. When I got to the hospital, they geared up in front of me and they took him in the back, and they wouldn't let me go back, with him. And I stayed in the waiting room waiting, and then they came out and they said, we've tried all we can't save it. That began the whirlwind of what happened, what did you do? And the first thing on my mind was, oh man, they finna lock me up because I left my son at the house. Never in a million years did I think that, hey, they gonna charge me with murder. I didn't think that. I thought that, about me leaving him at the house, which I knew that was wrong. So they told me to come down for questioning. So I went to the police station and I told them what happened. And they said, okay, well, go home. So the same day it happened, I went home. The next day I got up and I went to the hospital to try to see what the autopsy report said, not knowing that autopsy report takes a long time, before they have evidence as to, what happened. So I really didn't know. So when I got there, the detectives were there and they came and he said, well, we want to take you back down for more questioning. But when I got in the car with him, he said, boy, you in a lot of trouble. He said, if you wasn't in so much trouble, me and you could do some things, just like that. And I'm like, I stayed up all night crying, because I couldn't figure out what was wrong, what happened to my son. So they took me to the police station. And I think they questioned me for like 6 hours, screaming at me, yelling at me, telling me, you beat your baby, you stomped him, this is what you did. So he wrote out the statement. That is the statement that they initially used to take me to trial. I had 2 court-appointed attorneys. One was drunk during the whole trial, and the other one didn't do the investigative work. He just kept saying, we got this thing nipped in the bud, you just sit here and you just look. And I kept saying, I want to take the stand, I want to take the stand. He said, no, you don't need to take the stand. We got this thing. And the jury, they were at attention when the district attorney was talking. But when my attorneys talked, they were like looking at the ground, they was looking all around. To me, I got the impression that they knew what they was going to do before they even saw me, So just like that, they came back and they said, we find you guilty. So they wished me out, put me in the cell. Then the next day we had to go back for, to see if you, once you get sentenced, there's 2 phases in the capital case, sentencing, guilt or innocence, and sentencing. Okay, well, the second was sentencing. I had to go back for them to decide if I should get life or death. And they voted for death. March the 8th, 1990, I got the death penalty. I did 2 years, 9 months on death row, 6.5 years altogether. But the thing about being on death row is I did not have the right type of attorney. So when I went to death row, my death date was July the 2nd of 1990. Nobody told me that the state had to exhaust all state remedies before they could kill me. So I sat on death row that day thinking that that was my day to die. I paced the floors. I looked out the window. I listened for every chain, every sound, because I figured that, that was it. That was, they were gonna kill me. And I had a girl next to me that kept saying, she screamed through the wall, Sabrina, they can't do nothing to you, because the state's you gotta go back to trial. You gotta, So, I mean, that day was one of the worst days. And that's why I was trying to talk to the guy that was up before, that if you get it wrong, you can't change that. When you put someone on death row and take their life from them and they didn't commit a crime. My case was overturned in 92. I went back to trial. I had a new set of attorneys that I don't know where they came from. I just say they got sent. Clive Stafford Smith. Oh, man. You had him. I had him and I had Rob McDuff. And they came in and they proved that my son had heart problems, he had kidney problems, and he had chronic bowel syndrome. So it was nothing that we did wrong to cause his death. Today, I have an 11-year-old that has the same disease. She has kidney disease, and we're fighting for her life. They say that they can't save her kidneys. So that's what I say to people like him that rush to judgment. You know, yeah, sure, I was young. I wasn't educated. I didn't know a lot of things, but I did something about it. I went back to school. I got my education. I got college. I go around and I talk to the states about the death penalty because I want people to know that we hurt for what they did. And you can't fix that by telling me, oh, you're out, you're free, so, you know, go ahead on with your life. You can't fix that for me. You know what I mean? In 2009, the state passed a compensation plan for exonerees to receive compensation for wrongful conviction. I filed my claim in 2009. I won. I didn't have to. They settled with me. So they paid me for the next 6 years, $50,000 a year. Wow. I got 3 kids. $50,000 is like a person working. They took everything else from me. So I'm basically living, you know, on a budget. I don't have, you know, I have to buy my health insurance, you know, things like that. They didn't have any mental, you know, help for us when we first get out. None of that. I just got my case expunged this year in April, and I had to pay $450 for that. And the bad thing about that is, it's in the state of Mississippi, but it's not everywhere. I can go to another state and it's still there. So I'm still wearing this jacket on my back, you know what I'm saying, for the rest of my life, pretty much, for the mistake Mississippi made. But I refuse to. The district attorney, he's still there, still in office, almost 30 years. And I'm not going anywhere because I'm trying to unseat him. But my town is small and people don't want to go up against him. So, you know, this is what I do. But I wrote my book as a teaching tool to the youth to try to show you that just because something bad happens to you, you don't have to stay in that. You can change your life. It's a decision. It's a choice. And my choice was to tell my story to help, you know, other people, to give them, you know, better, you know, so that we can affect a change, not just, you know, something to do. Thank you. Okay.
Well, thank you, Sabrina, for sharing your story. Next up, we have Laurence Ralph, and I'll be, you know, brief. Laurence is an assistant professor of anthropology and African American Studies at Harvard University, and his new book is called Renegade Dreams: Living Through Injury in Gangland, Chicago. And this is really an extraordinary ethnography about gang violence in Chicago, on the west side of Chicago, but also about the way in which those who experience that gang violence, some of whom live with chronic injury, really conceptualize their world and our world in terms of there's still a pursuit of racial and economic justice, even for those who have been participating in violent activity. So it really humanizes and adds so much layers to our understanding of Black urban life in Chicago and around the country. So with that, I'll say, you know, Laurence Ralph.
Thanks for the intro, Peniel, and thanks for Aaron for the invitation, an opportunity to speak here. in terms of what I want to say today, I just have been taken with the whole event, and so I want to make it more conversational and speak in terms of things that are brought up in the context of the conversation today, and I'll try to tie it into my particular work as well. So, as Peniel said, I do research on the west side of Chicago in a low-income community, and in this community, really the problem of violence, the problem of crime, the problem of even lack of education can be situated within the context of the gang, right? So Chicago has a long history of gang involvement. In the community where I do research, there's been a gang presence for more than 50 years. And one of the key aspects of my research is how people kind of live through the injuries that they experience. I follow gang members who have been shot and paralyzed, and they go around the schools and talk about their experience, what it's like to live with the injury, right? What it's like to not be dead, but to be injured and to have to kind of recalibrate your life because of that injury. And I think that really resonates with what Sabrina just said in terms of what it means to have been injured, right? And have to recalibrate your life in terms of that injury. And how do you then try to craft a life for yourself that's then not just about you, but it's about the social injustice that you experienced as a result, right? In the first panel, what struck me most was a kind of set of contradictions that I think Aaron Kelly rightly put in terms of a moral issue, a morality, right? And so I think when Robert was speaking, he was saying that had he lived in the time of slavery, he might, and had he been a slave master, he might have felt that it was morally right to murder a slave, right? And he might not felt anything about that, and that would have been the time and that he lived in, but objectively speaking, would have been morally wrong, right? And I think that when we think about the legacy of racism, something like racism, we also not only have to think about a time that is past that we have now transcended, but the continuities, right, that exist between then and now. And I think structural racism in our criminal justice system as a whole is part of that continuity, right? And so when I speak of structural racism, on the one hand, I'm speaking of the fact that, again, going back to Sabrina's example, it's not just that they wrongly convicted her, that they thought that she had abused her child when she hadn't, but they had an idea of what black mothering looked like, right? And they had an idea of that this is something particularly a black mother would do to a black child, right? And that cultural idea of black deviance is what also allowed her to suffer through what she suffered through. When you think about structural racism, again, Aaron pointed to this contradiction between the statistical inevitability of something like incarceration or death row, the fact that it's overwhelmingly or disproportionately people of color, right? Or when you think about mass incarceration, it's disproportionately people of color who suffer this same fate. Again, in the community where I do research, 75% of all males have been arrested, have been involved in the criminal justice system. 57% of everyone, whether you're a man or a woman, has been involved in the criminal justice system. The community is 41,000 people. 13,000 people who would otherwise live in that community are currently serving time in an Illinois penitentiary, right? When they go out, when they are released from prison, they will likely go into one of 4 neighborhoods in Chicago, right? And so it's not just that people do things and they're incarcerated for the things that they do, but we know it's structural racism because particular communities, particular people are impacted in particular ways, right? And so the moral quandary is, how is it that if we know that there's a statistical inevitability that a large percentage of people will be locked up every year, and that this large percentage of people that will be locked up every year will be people of color, how do we then reduce each individual instance to a particular thing that happened? How do we then reduce it to, oh, this person shot someone, right? This person, abused their child when they shouldn't have. This person stole something from a convenience store, and just because of that, a cop shot him, right? Though reducing it to what Aaron was talking about in terms of responsibility, or reducing it to that individual act, is a way of masking the structural inequalities that persist, right? And that's what makes this a moral problem. That's what gives it a kind of moral urgency when we think about the death penalty and mass incarceration. So the last thing I'll say is that when we think about the relationship between mass incarceration and something like death penalty, even though in Illinois they abolished the death penalty in 2011, the kind of conditions under which someone is executed and the conditions under which someone is caught up in the system of mass incarceration are the same, right? On the one hand, oftentimes people, again, come from poor communities. On the other hand, because of that, they don't have access to adequate representation, as Sabrina kind of talked about. And, there are other problems that have to do with those confluence of factors, such as like mental illness, right? So you're mentioning that somebody's about to be executed next week, December 3rd, that have mental issue problems, right? And again, this overlaps with particular ideas that we have about people's places in the world, right? Because gang members in Chicago don't get the same benefit of the doubt when it comes to responsibility and mental illness as does someone who shoots up a high school, right? It's almost presumed that they did that because they have a mental health issue. But when a Chicago gang member does it, it's presumed that he shot somebody because he's in a gang, or because he has the wrong values, or because he's inherently deviant, right? So even how we conceive of responsibility are colored by these historical legacies, which again have to do with structural racism. So I guess I'll end here, but I just want to again reiterate the fact that that's why I'm so interested in this idea of a renegade dream, or the idea of how people live through injury, because I think that on the one hand, and this is another kind of moral contradiction, we should feel happy that an exonerated person is now free, right? But on the other hand, what does it mean to have to live your life just to kind of meet the needs of basic living, right? And it's the same thing with the gang members that I work with. On the one hand, they're happy that they were paralyzed and they're not dead, right? But on the other hand, so much of their life is now dedicated to talking about gang violence, to just trying to meet basic needs, and it's not dedicated to the kind of broad pursuits that we associate with a larger American dream, right? And so what role does our criminal justice play into that, and how do we fix that, are the questions that I think we're charged with answering in this conference, in this panel.
Next is David Harris, who's the Managing Director of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice at Harvard Law. David has previously worked with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, and he's been at the Commission on Civil Rights, where he conducted studies on the civil rights implications of domestic violence in Connecticut, legislative redistricting in Rhode Island, and highway construction on integrated neighborhoods. David has extensive experience in many facets of civil rights issues, from police brutality and racial profiling to redistricting and domestic violence, as well as fair housing and community development. Prior to his position at the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute, he served as founding executive director of the Fair Housing Center of Greater Boston. During his tenure there, he became nationally recognized among fair housing organizations. The center's work generated several original analyses of housing discrimination patterns in Greater Boston, and the organization became a leading force for fair housing and regional equity. David is recognized as a leading voice for civil rights in the Boston region, and I can attest to that, and has spoken extensively at local, regional, and national forums on civil rights, regional equity, and fair housing. David has a PhD in sociology from Harvard and a BA from Georgetown University, and is an adjunct faculty member of Cambridge College. David is the president of the board of directors of the Massachusetts Foundation for the Humanities. Whew, there's a lot of stuff there.
Come on, don't read it.
And he it's good to read. And he lives in West Medford with his wife and son. Okay. David Harris.
I guess, thank you. And Aaron, thank you for inviting me. In Truth in Advertising, they wanted Charles Overtree, but he couldn't come, so I'm here. But I'm glad to be here. And I have some prepared remarks. I'll kind of add a little bit, but I'm often reminded in these contexts of a joke that I used to tell students. And there's a student who is taking zoology, and all semester long he hasn't gone to class, he hasn't studied at all, he hasn't done anything, and he gets really nervous come final time, and he goes up to a friend of his who had taken the class the year before. He says, "Man, I'm really messed up. What do I do now?" And the friend said, "Listen, man, go home the next 2 days, learn everything you can about worms. This guy always asks a question about worms on the final." You heard this joke, sister? Did you hear me tell this joke before? You might have. You can see. Okay. So he goes and he sits down on he goes into the test. He's bright. He's tired, but he's ready because he knows everything there is to know about worms. And he opens up the book with the exam question, and the question is, "Tell us everything you know about elephants." About elephants. And the kid just starts to falls off the chair. He doesn't know what to do. He's just totally at a loss. And he's agonizing, writhing, and a light goes on, and he starts writing very furiously. Elephants are very large mammals. They have several unique characteristics. They have large ears. They have tusks. They have a trunk. The trunk looks very much like worms, and worms. And he proceeds to say everything about worms. He knows about. I always used to give this as an example of how to take a test. Right? Always answer the question you're prepared for, not the one you're asked. And I'll say that for us at the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute, unfortunately, race is the worm in the apple. Yeah. And much of what I wind up talking about has to do with race. And I'm going to talk a little bit about race today. So one of the reasons I was really glad to be able to come is because one of the things that I do and we do at the Houston Institute is very much think about the relationship between mass incarceration and the death penalty. It's what we do. We think about it a lot. And one of the things that our work traces to an invitation I had several years ago to come to a conference and try to start a conversation about race that didn't start with black people, right? And at the time, we were doing a lot of work thinking about the death penalty. And I was kind of painfully aware of how many people, what's the most likely predictor of whether or not the death penalty will be invoked or sought? Anybody? What's the variable that's most likely to predict that? Now choose. Okay, you're not really in class. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Kathy.
Murder victim.
Yes, murder victim. Race of victim, right? If the victim is white, regardless of the perpetrator, it is more likely that there will be a death penalty case. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about that issue, and at the time there was a growing interest and awareness about the cost of the death penalty, right? And it was becoming obvious that we as a nation were spending a huge amount of money on the death penalty. And at the same time, we at the Institute were doing work on things like school-to-prison pipeline, the opportunity gap for students, the reentry of people returning from incarceration to communities. And you talk about your moral dilemma. It created several important questions for us, right? The first is, what kind of a society are we that dedicates the kind of resources we were dedicating to vindicate the rights of a very small number of white victims, while entire communities of color were going under-resourced, underserved, and ignored? Okay? The second question in that series is, what does it say about the priorities of a society that chooses that way? What does it say about a society that chooses the priorities that way? And the third thing, and most important, was, are we, as a society, actually making this choice? Or, if given more complete information, would we make a different set of choices? So that question, the answer to these questions, if you adopt a kind of critical race theory, the answer to these questions could be a little bit simple. We're a kind of society that operates with an under law and an implicit racial contract underneath our social contract. So that in fact, things are structured in ways that the rights of whites are valued more than the rights of people of color. And I think I probably subscribe to that a bit, but we started to say, let's suspend that analysis for a moment and start to think about, when we talk about what kind of society are we that chooses this way, who's the we, right? And so we have to think about whose voice is heard in the creation of public policy and whose voices are not heard, right? And again, that brings us back to this question that our communities, those very communities that are under-resourced, that are in need of more resources, are the ones that are the least heard in public policy debates, right? And so again, we have this situation where we have a huge amount of resources being spent on white victims while communities of color are deprived. So again, I have these quotes here. There's a guy named Timothy Kaufman Osborne who points out in Charles Ogletree's book, From Lynch Mobs to the Killing State, he says, the administration of capital punishment in the United States, like the practice of lynching, is one of the state practices by means of which the racial polity is reproduced, right? So the death penalty effectively reinforces other aspects of racial inequality in ways that are disturbing. I'm loath to kind of invoke the notion of lynching because it's a fairly difficult thing to think about, but I don't do it lightly. And in fact, in our work, we start to think about the operation of implicit bias. We've all heard about that, these kind of unconscious biases that guide and affect our behavior. And I would suggest to you that to the extent that we are willing to entertain that, we need to also recognize that there are these other kind of unconscious issues and images that continue to haunt us, and lynching is one of them. So for communities of color, the notion of capital punishment brings out these other notions of lynching and these what Kaufman Osborne calls this kind of spectacle lynching. And so we can't think about the death penalty and separate it from these other historical practices. And if you need any reminder of whether whites can do that, I would point out the fact that after the Jena 6 incident several years ago, these nooses started appearing all across the country. And those nooses were meant precisely to remind us of this history and of who has the power in the society. So let me come back to this question about how we choose. Okay. At the Houston Institute, as Peniel suggested, we have this idea, this model about doing our work in ways that gives voice to those voices that are in fact not heard. And we think we're obligated to do that, and we spend a lot of time thinking about how to do that. And if you think about the reality of the situation is, in a state like California, I'm going to use California as an example for a lot of things. So California, as you all know, barely, can I say barely? It wasn't as close, but we'll say barely, failed to pass a referendum that would have abolished the death penalty in California, right, a couple of years ago. Now, at the same time, California, over the last 30 years or something, has spent $4 billion, $4 billion prosecuting and incarcerating people who have been sentenced to die. Right? And in that process, they in fact execute very few, right? Which means that the cost of each one of those prosecutions is immense, right? So that's the bad news. California failed to pass that proposition. In that same election, however, they did pass a proposition that limited and drew back on three strikes legislation. The very practice that in fact led California to lead the nation in terms of who was incarcerated. A federal judge to force them to release people because they had far too many people in their prisons than was permissible. So, but what they did with that was they said, part of the logic of that was, we need to save that money so we can put that money into law enforcement. Right? Now, our position is that that's a circular argument, right? Because law enforcement is what's getting us in the jam in the first place. The fact of the matter is that that money needs to be spent and rededicated to the kinds of issues that confront our communities and the kinds of things that in fact are what are called front-end issues, right? So we had a lot of trouble with that, but then California can always, has a way of jerking us around. And this past election, they passed another referendum that further diminished the number of crimes for which kind of mandatory sentences were invoked and what have you. And they specified the use of that money for certain kinds of other programs. Now, that were not law enforcement specific. Now, we can quibble with some of it, so they wanted to put the money into truancy prevention, right? So maybe that, it's a step in the right direction that doesn't really address broad needs in communities, but it was a step in the right direction. And it was the result of very direct action by groups of people who were mobilized with information on what works to basically convince people that it was good, sound public policy. So even in states that don't have the death penalty, like Massachusetts, we think that this question about the allocation of resources is critical. So not only in Illinois, but here in Massachusetts, we're prone to do we see the same kind of contract in operation. So, as some of you may know, 3 years ago, we had a terrible murder that took place in Woburn of a police officer, and immediately the Massachusetts legislature decided that we needed three strikes legislation, right? So the rest of the country, right, is moving away from it, and as a knee-jerk response to the death of this one white victim, we decided we needed three strikes legislation here, all right? Now, do people remember this? Right? Now, that legislation passed almost unanimously, with the only votes against it passed by black legislators, right? I mean, it was one of the most stark examples of the division in our society. And part of the issue that we see before us is, kind of how do we move this other population? So I'm going to wrap up in a minute. So we've done a lot of work and research on kind of how you communicate about criminal justice reform. And our work also at the Houston Institute is very much and specifically designed to try to bridge criminal justice reform with death penalty reform. And I'm going to speak frankly here. We know that, historically, the death penalty movement is populated by Birkenstocks and Volvos and Vermonters and, has a reputation of not being a particularly diverse community. I mean, is that safe to say? Okay, all right. I don't want to offend anybody. But the fact is that the movement has lately come to understand and realize that it needs to diversify its constituency. And one of the issues we need to do is figure out how to talk about the need to dismantle mass incarceration and the death penalty as a part of that, right? Not as separate and distinct from it, okay? But we encountered lots of problems in that regard. So, again, in California, one of the things that they found is that one of the ways that you can move public opinion against the death penalty in favor of life without the possibility of parole over capital punishment is to emphasize the fact that death penalty, those who are incarcerated for death penalty, will be required to work. Right? Will be required to work. Now, so that moves people. Now, it's an interesting proposal and what have you, but for lots of people of color within the death penalty movement, and certainly within the greater civil rights movement, this is reminiscent of what? Convict labor. It sounds like, are you kidding me? You know, I mean, we went through, several decades to overcome the practice of convict labor, and now we're going to sell death penalty abolition with the notion that we're going to put these people to work. So again, I think the issue on the topic, there's a lot of conversation we need to have between those who are interested in dismantling mass incarceration and those who are interested in abolishing the death penalty. And part of that conversation has to start by understanding and recognizing the various forces at work here. I'm going to close by reading to you something that we published. We have been involved and engaged in the effort to save Troy Davis's life. And, as you know, we failed. But after his execution, which took place on the same day as Laurence Brewer was executed for the murder of James, the brutal murder of James Brewer, we issued this statement, and I think it's apt and I'll close on. From a race and justice perspective, we are compelled to contrast the glaring disparities in the ways in which the victims' families were treated and listened to in these two cases. The McPhail family, which was the family of the police officer who was killed in the Troy Davis case, the equation of Davis's execution with its ability to find peace and move on appears to have contributed to the decision by the Georgia Parole Board to deny clemency for Davis. In contrast, the family of James Byrd Jr., the African-American who was dragged to death by Laurence Brewer, eloquently pleaded against executing Brewer, insisting that another death would accomplish little beside the perpetuation of the cycle of violence we continue to inflict upon ourselves. Yet their pleas were completely unheeded. McPhail was white, Byrd was black. In a pattern that mirrors so many aspects of American society, it is the white family's pleas that carry the weight within the social, political, and legal domains, while the black family's desires are ignored. In the United States, the legal system judges lawbreakers and determines punishment. That's right. We at the Houston Institute do not make light of the horror and unspeakable suffering of those who lose loved ones to violence. What we object to and will continue to fight against is the misappropriation of the legal system to meet the personal desires for vengeance while simultaneously failing to meet the basic needs of our communities. We believe in and will continue to fight for the basic principle that the United States can become the inclusive community its founding documents so eloquently and persuasively promise. To reach that goal requires diligent and vigilant commitment to balancing the overall needs of communities with individual rights. And obtaining that balance means ensuring that the voices of those so long excluded from the public forum are heard and honored. Until that happens, as so many have declared in recent weeks, we are Troy Davis. Thank you.
All right, thank you, David. Thank you, all the panelists. I'm going to just try to do a short summation here and really talk about policy. The ACLU released a great report in October, the Boston ACLU. This is available online. And this is titled Black, Brown, and Targeted, and it's a report on Boston Police Department street encounters from 2007 to 2010. And the reason it only goes up to 2010 is because the BPD hasn't released up-to-date figures. They say they will, but they haven't released up-to-date figures. And this caused some controversy in Boston locally when it was released. I want to read off a couple of key facts, and there's a 2-page summary, a stop and frisk report summary. 63% of Boston police civilian encounters from 2007 to 2010 targeted blacks, even though blacks made up less than 25% of the city's population. Even after controlling for crime, Boston police officers were more likely to initiate police encounters in black neighborhoods and to initiate encounters with black people. Boston police gave essentially no justification for 75% of these encounters, simply listing investigate person as the reason, which is not constitutional. More than 200,000 encounters led to no arrest, and only 2.5% led to seizure of contraband. The BPD has utilized racially biased policing as shown by data from reports of 200,000 plus encounters during this time period. This racial disparity cannot be explained away by BPD efforts to target crime. The researchers' preliminary statistical analysis found that the racial composition of Boston neighborhoods drove police civilian encounters even after controlling for crime rates and other factors. They also found that blacks were more likely than whites to be subject to repeat police civilian encounters and to be frisked or searched even after controlling for civilians' alleged gang involvement and history of prior arrest. In terms of what did the ACLU recommend, number one was body-worn cameras, requiring all officers who engage in any police civilian encounters to wear and use body-worn cameras during every interaction with the public. Number two was police civilian receipts, provide documentation, i.e. a receipt to any civilian involved in a stop, frisk, search, or consensual interview or search. And finally, regular data reporting, publish on a quarterly basis electronic data on all stops, frisks, searches, observations, and consensual and non-consensual interviews and searches, including a breakdown by race, gender, age, and the officer's basis for encounter and action. I start off with that because I think all these discussions around mass incarceration, the death penalty, hugely important. We've heard really great and moving narratives today. This is all connected to public policy because we live in a democracy. Even though sometimes when I write about race and democracy, and there's a Center for the Study of Race and Democracy here at Tufts, people will say, well, what's the punchline, right? That we live in a democracy. But we live in a democracy, and it's important, especially right now. I think we're all waiting to hear about Ferguson and whether there's going to be an indictment. There's a state of emergency in Missouri. I think there's going to be a Ferguson teach-in here on Friday. I should plug that from 1 to 6. But I think what's important for us to understand is, why does Ferguson matter? Why does mass incarceration matter? How can we connect this to public policy? But also in terms of race, how can this issue be an issue that actually unites us across race, class, and gender divides? Because it actually is such an issue. But I agree with what David has said in the sense that when we think about anti-death penalty, too often it's been a specific homogeneous community that's talking about anti-death penalty. And within that community, even though at times black people have been aided by that kind of activism, race hasn't been central to the anti-death penalty discourse, right? And that discourse gets impoverished when race isn't central to it. Because race is central to the way in which not just policing practices here in the United States, but public policy in the post-civil rights period. There's a great paper online that we're going to give out during the teach-in about Ferguson that a social scientist has written. It's 50, 60, 70 pages. And that paper looks at Ferguson not just from a standpoint of criminal justice, right, and law and order. It looks at public policy, and not just in Ferguson, but the city of St. Louis, and the St. Louis County area. Public policy since the New Deal that enacted racial segregation, but not just racial segregation, even citywide and countywide ordinances that allowed whites to build homes that had no industry in them, neighborhoods that had no, liquor stores, right? African Americans, sky-rise housing projects. the New Deal and the FHA, the Federal Housing Authority, actually furthers racial segregation. So you have communities in St. Louis in the 1930s and 40s that were relatively racially diverse and mixed. And once you get new housing, and the FHA says that blacks can't be included in this housing, you get all white housing projects and all black housing projects, but mostly you get all white residential suburbs, right? And when we think about the equity in that housing over the past 50, 60, and 70 years, it explains much of the wealth gap at the level of individuals, not the wealth gap when it comes to corporate America and legacy wealth in terms of individuals, the Kennedys, the Rockefellers, but wealth gap in terms of the black middle class versus the white middle class, white upper middle class versus the black upper middle class, and really black and white working class and their disparities. When we think about Ferguson, we can connect what's going on in Ferguson to what's happening right here in Massachusetts. Everything from quarry reform to this recent report by the ACLU. We have to connect this with policy and ask for policy reform. I think one of the most interesting aspects that I've seen since teaching here at Tufts in the last few years has been the best-selling status of Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, right? And you know, I teach it, students love it, but part of what happens when our students get involved and thinking about the new Jim Crow, mass incarceration, is that too many students don't want to confront the racial aspect of this new Jim Crow, even as they are against mass incarceration, even as they are for racial justice and for economic justice. They're against the death penalty, they're against mass incarceration, but they're uncomfortable with how race is central to these policies, right? So I think that one of the things that I'd love for us to talk about, and everybody's talked about this here in individual ways, but it really in a meta-national way, how can we transform these policies, especially in a country that doesn't want to talk about race, and not just race, and David talked about this. We're talking about an issue of black equality as well, because this issue of black equality as a common denominator is so important to everybody who's interested in LGBT rights, who's interested in things like mental health issues, stopping domestic violence, immigration reform and a pathway to citizenship for 11 million undocumented human beings. We keep on saying that they're illegals when they're actually human beings, and it's a country founded on immigration, and there are millions of whites who live in this country now who came into this country illegally in terms of legacy-wise, right? I'm talking about before Ellis Island, before the early 20th century, right? And so when we think about this idea of black equality, the reason why it's so central is because the country is founded on racial slavery. We've lost that story. We've lost that narrative. And if we can make that central to this movement to end mass incarceration, to end the death penalty, we will all be enriched for it. And finally, I'll say, in terms of the policy-wise, one of the things that people have talked about in terms of Ferguson, they just announced not only a 30-day state of emergency, but a biracial commission, right? A biracial commission to sort of study the problem. And as a historian, this reminded me of Birmingham. It reminded me of places in Mississippi where people would establish biracial commissions. I'm not saying that it's not a good idea, but the thing that will save folks, not just in Ferguson, but in Boston, is public policy. It's public policy. People actually know, social scientists know, we have the data in a systematic way what's wrong with not just the criminal justice system, but the criminal justice system is tied into our public schools. It's tied into residential segregation. It's tied into the lack of resources and social services in communities of color, but also in white communities as well, right? So if we can think about this as a huge problem that we can actually solve through public policy. And the public policy, when we think about ending mass incarceration and ending everything from the disparity in terms of crack versus powdered cocaine, not just at the federal level, but at the state level, ending 3 strikes throughout the country, certainly ending the death penalty, right? But there are policy solutions to these big problems. Sometimes we think, well, we're going to need a revolution. We're going to need to take over the White House to get this to happen. Certainly, if we think about social change that's happened, whether it's the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act, there was at least radical political activism at the grassroots, and you can say a kind of social revolution. That can happen again, but it's going to take more than electing a black president. It's going to take more than electing a black governor here in the state of Massachusetts. It's going to take grassroots activism, which is connected to scholars, which is connected to everything that we're doing here. IGL, CSRD, the Charles Hamilton Houston, the Hamilton Institute, all these things is going to take all of us together fomenting a public policy discussion, right? This is all, and again, we can't give a list of 100 things. It has to be a list of 10 things that can actually pass. Because certainly we could all come up with a list right now of 1,000 things that we want changed, right? It's very hard to organize around 1,000 different points. But if we can boil this down to very key public policy, not just reforms, but transformations, we can connect what's going on with Ferguson to what's going on in Boston to what's going on across the United States. And I hope that in the Q&A we can talk about some of these things. Thank you. All right, so let's open it up. Can you stand up and just tell us your name, questions? Yes, Sister Asia.
I'm Sister Helen. The racism in the Supreme Court.
Absolutely.
This is a McCluskey decision. They had the result of the study that showed so clearly it's white victims. And they acknowledged that race plays a part, but said it would be too
Too much.
destructive.
It's too hard.
I mean, that's bad.
It's too hard.
If we had another whole day, I would really like to talk about Clarence Thomas, because I'm worried about him. I really am.
Well, you know, since it's
But I
not
mean,
just,
this racism in the community. Anybody
this-
got any insights?
there's no pill for that, right? There's no pill for that.
Oh, we don't want a pill.
There's no pill for that, right?
What's going on?
You know, again, I mean, it's an institute. You know, I know it's kind of a rhetorical question, but it's an institution, right? The Supreme Court is an institution. It's not just Clarence Thomas, right? I mean, you have a guy like Justice Kennedy, right? Who everybody, you know, who is everybody's swing vote on every decision, right? You know, I don't know if you remember in the parents involved case, which was the school desegregation case, you know, Justice Kennedy actually said out loud from the bench, we could solve the problem of school integration, remember this, by putting a school on the boundary between a black community and a white community. Right? That was his solution, right? So, and what does that solution do? It says, let's have black communities and white communities, and let's just put these schools on the border. It doesn't say anything about why we have white communities and black communities and getting rid of it. So I think the court itself, I mean, we put a lot, I was just saying somebody else, we put some faith in that court at some point on the death penalty, I think. You know, there's some hope at some point, I don't know. But I mean, this is one part of Peniel, but the kind of the racism that's inherent in the institution doesn't actually reside in those individuals, right? It's not, you know, it has to do with the institution itself. And it has to do, you know, with the fact that the institution is bound up in some of the contradictions of our society, right? I mean, it's enforcing a constitution itself that is internally inconsistent.
And not just the death penalty in terms of the Supreme Court, the Shelby Holder decision, the Senate said, hey, it was 98 something to you know, extend the Voting Rights Act with all of its provisions, right? And in 2013, Supreme Court SCOTUS, and again, that SCOTUS decision about Shelby versus Ferguson, which stops the overseeing, the federal oversight, the enforcement of the Voting Rights Act, it's going to have huge reverberations for all of us, because what's going on, whether it's in 2016 and all the midterms, states and voter IDs are making it impossible for millions of people to vote. So the idea that demography is destiny is false when you don't have the right to vote. And again, it's not going to impact elites across any lines, racial, you know, especially elites, for communities of color, especially if you're communities of color or people of color who live in predominantly white communities because they're not doing the challenges. I will say, if you're African American and you're in places like Prince George's County, people are going to be checking for ID in different ways that they hadn't before. But the Supreme Court, I think David is exactly right. It's reflective of these larger social forces, but I think we've not understood how deep the Shelby versus Holder decision is going to affect everything, because literally there's millions of people who aren't going to have the right to vote and who don't have the right to vote at the state level, because again, something as simple, I voted in Somerville for the midterms. Nobody asked me for an ID. Walked in, they asked me my name, I was on the voter roll, they let me vote. Not one person asked me for an identification, right? And so the idea that we need to have ID to vote.
No, it's already happening.
Yeah.
It's Louisiana, Texas, it's already happening.
Yeah. And it's happening in the Confederacy, but it's also happening in Pennsylvania, right? So it's happening in the old Confederacy.
It happened in Oregon just recently.
Yeah. And again, I mean, what's interesting is if the presidential election goes, you know, the next elections, the next two are very important because we have justices who are in their 70s and 80s. So there could be a swing potentially, and if there's a swing potentially, many things potentially could change, including not just Shelby versus Holder and things connected to race and the death penalty, but also Citizens United and money in campaigns, because Citizens United was decided 5-4, where we've got global money. You can spend as much money on any election, and the money can come from anywhere, right? It can come from, you know, just anybody. Drug dealers, aliens, anybody can be part of U.S. elections. Anybody else? I sense a question coming. Can you tell us who you are?
Hi, I'm Kathy Spillman from Witness to Innocence, and I work with Sabrina and the lawyer. Lawyer is the only person exonerated from death row in the state of Massachusetts. He's also, he was the last person on death row before mass outlawed. So just want to give you a shout out, lawyer. But anyways, I just want to make a comment. I had a question. Comment to David about Proposition 34 in California. Came this close to abolishing the death penalty in California.
Yeah, I was there.
Sabrina and I actually worked on the campaign, and I worked with some other exonerees that went out there. And we had a terrible struggle with the people who were running that campaign because they wanted to focus on conservatives to a great extent. And I felt that their failure to reach more people of color doomed that proposition. If they had done a better job in integrating that into their campaign, making it a focus indeed, you know, that proposition would have passed. And it's a big problem in our abolition movement. I found it symbolic.
So you know, Kathy, that we were involved in making those efforts, but you know, it's like a politician going into a neighborhood when he wants your vote, right? You know, you can't come in just to ask people, you know, on a single issue, right? So you can't, you know, and you can't just go to what you think are the black churches, or you know, you can't.
I felt they took the communities of color for granted in California, that they were automatically going to vote for Proposition 34, and therefore they could be ignored. Kind of like what happened with Proposition 8 in a way. There's some similarities, I thought.
Do you recall what that Proposition 34 would have lost by? Does anybody recall?
It lost by 2 or 3
4%.
points, that's it.
Okay.
So, but in California, that's a lot of votes.
Yeah, that's a lot of votes in California.
No, it is, but still.
It's a small percentage, so it could potentially.
It could have passed, I think. But I wanted to get back to what you were saying about how do we marry, you know, we need public policy change because we're talking about structural issues. I agree 100%. You know, beyond the racist that posts on my Facebook page, you know, it's not just about individuals, it's fundamentally structural. But how do we wed academia, you know, all of us are here today, how
So that's obviously the challenge, and I know Peniel is doing that. I mean, it is happening. So, you know, I didn't talk about it, but we actually have this thing we're doing called Houston Labs, and you know what? Houston Labs. I'm sorry, Houston Labs, and what it? Oh, come on, sister. I'm gonna let him stand up, and I sit down.
Y'all can both stand.
Oh no, I'm fine standing.
Yeah, I know, that's it. Again, I mean, I think our focus, some very specific things. We work with, we at the Houston Institute don't do things, right? We are conveners, connectors, you know, and so we're working very closely here in Massachusetts and in other parts of the country with groups and organizations that are actually doing work on the ground in communities. And the point is, when I said this question about you know, the ability to shape policy, the way you do that is you get sufficient information into people's hands that they can in fact start to advocate on the issues that are of concern to them. So the first thing you have to do is listen. You know, so if you ask people in a community, what do you consider to be the public safety needs of your community, right? And we do this. You know, you find out lots of very interesting and important things. It's not just cops. It's not just prosecution. It's addressing issues of trauma. It's addressing public health issues. It's all kinds of things. And then the question is, how do you kind of you analyze the extent to which so the first thing you're going to hear is that there's not enough money to do all of that. Well, that's where this issue of resource allocation comes in, and you say, yes, there's enough money for you to do this other thing. I want you to take the money from that, and I want to use it this way. But you have to be able to mobilize around that. So here in Massachusetts, we work with a group called Mothers for Justice and Equality, right? It's an amazing grassroots organization. Have you all heard of it? Well, you should have it. Part of my job is to make sure that you have. Mothers for Justice and Equality was founded by mothers in Roxbury who have lost children to gun violence, right?
Like Mothers in Charge in Philly.
Yes, very much like it, and out of the same impulse, right? And it has grown, and in fact, you know, we've been involved. They've been connected to mothers in Ferguson, right? So they're working with them, and so the point is that they, in fact, are the ones who have, but the problem is you need more than, you have to connect a kind of mass, right? And you have to be able to bring that kind of effort to scale, and the way to do that is to have the resources that are available. Because, you know, they're small, they work it out of a little basement in Roxbury, you know, so that's the kind of work that we have to do.
Yeah, no, I would reiterate that. I mean, I think at the center we have, you know, with the bandwidth that we have, we've been trying to do the same thing. We also have student fellows who are out, you know, in the community doing research on a number of different issues, some related to incarceration, but some related to civil rights and voting and other issues. And we, you know, we're conveners as well. So we've done different dialogues. We're doing the Ferguson teach-in. We brought different, which are open to the public, and which we try to connect with, you know, nonprofit groups, but grassroots activists as well. Because I think the thing that institutions can do in terms of higher ed is serve as hubs that offer research, that offer expertise, but also disseminate knowledge, right? And allow these institutions, which is great that you're here today, and we've done the same thing at the center, and I know that IGL has done the same thing, that allows folks who might not be connected to the university in a formal way come and realize that the university is their home as well. I mean, these are communities, and they shouldn't be ivory towers. They should be communities that are open, and they're public spaces. And I think at Tufts, we haven't done as good of a job as we will ultimately, but I think many of us are trying to make sure that extends. And by doing this kind of work, you do get communities of color. So beyond the Somerville, Medford communities, but communities of color in Dorchester, Roxbury, who are coming into these spaces that they otherwise might not have access to.
So what about we take the space here and take it out to Dorchester?
Oh, absolutely. And we've done that. We've actually done that. We've actually done that.
I don't know really what you guys do here, but like in Philly, it's hard to get the university
No, absolutely. No, absolutely. We actually. Oh, I completely agree. And you know, I think I do that. I know David does that, so we do that. Right here and then Aaron. Can you stand up and tell us who you are?
I worked with Tufts University for like almost 8 years, you know, and like I was deep involved. I'm still is somewhat, but at this stage right now in my life, man, I'm somewhat. I would say it's apathy, man, you know, but it's overwhelming, man. You know, when I see that we're the majority to the people of color, you know, in Boston, you know, and we still got white mayor, man. We the majority, man. I'm traumatized by that. Other things I'm traumatized by, you know. I don't know, man. People that make the public possible, it's going to be a tall task, man. You know, like if you're willing and able, man, to take on that challenge, man. You know, it's challenge is others, business, man. You know? And it's expected too.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I agree. But you know, one thing what you're saying in terms of the mayor's race, and I think about and somebody who I've met and who's done such important work here, and I'm sure you have as well, Mel King, and the activism that Mel King has done for decades and decades. Mel King and his wife. I think the reason why there was not a Latino mayor or a Cape Verdean mayor or African American mayor or first black woman as mayor here is just about communities of color and just the organizing within those communities, both across racial lines but also within. So there was a lack of you know, clear organizing among those communities for you know, to pick a candidate, to pick a candidate that they felt comfortable and who would be accountable to the community. That could have been Charlotte Golorici, it could have been Felix Arroyo, it could have been all these different people, but for some reason that didn't happen. And then you've got Mayor Walsh, and really the final two, which disappointed a lot of people. And I think it disappointed white people too, that the final two candidates were white males. I think that disappointed people who wanted a different choice, who wanted a much more diverse choice in Boston. So I agree with you there.
Also, in addition to that, I was telling that you overall, like how I seen the Attorney General, man, like the powers that they got in terms of like since people actually.
Okay. You're talking about Martha Coakley or the Attorney General in terms of Eric Holder.
Well, the one that has who didn't like some church.
Okay. Yeah. I think that was Coakley with Chuck Turner, right?
No, it wasn't Cook.
Who was it with Chuck?
And those were state charges. Those were federal charges.
Oh, those are federal
So
charges?
that was Ortiz, I think.
Okay. I think so. Okay.
I think those are federal charges.
He said that before to Chuck.
Okay.
Inspired by the DA or the Attorney General, I guess name, you know. But look, I mean, they tell you what they'll do to you, man. If they can do that, you know, what happened to Chuck? I mean, as far as like sending people at you.
Yeah, yeah. Black politicians who've been
It's not
indicted.
a difference is the fact that there's $1,000 if that informer would have told, if Chuck would have told that informer, well, take that $1,000 and put it in my campaign fund. I'm right there, I'm right there. It's all he has to do. But instead of doing that, he just took his hand.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is we can see it there, right? That get people, man, to really motivate people, man, to go against the system.
No, I understand what you're
And
saying.
look, we've been trying this since the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to sound discouraging, you know. That's why I somewhat admire this whole Ferguson movement, if you will.
Yeah.
Because, man, it got to be some kind of revitalization, man, right? That will always be consistent and not filter out like it was in the past. Just what the students, what they, I feel they're overall, you know, I see their face in it. I mean, but what can we actually do? I don't know, man. Like I said, it's nothing gives them power easy, you know. I think the only way when you're there, man, is just hopefully, man, wait till they die out, man, you know. Yeah, you know, I mean, the idea is that we all protect them now was, you know, slowly getting time to control it. You know?
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody want to comment?
Okay.
Take one more question.
Aaron?
I had a couple questions for Laurence Ralph. If I was following you, you made a very suggestive and powerful analogy, I thought, between somebody who was in a gang and suffered from a serious injury and would have to reckon with that injury in the future in that person's life, and that the significance of that injury kind of organizes that person's life going forward in a very basic way. So it's their mental life and efforts are revolving around dealing with this injury and seeking some kind of, I think you mentioned at some point, a sense of justice as a way of kind of reckoning with that. And then on the other hand, the analogy was somebody who's been in prison, coming out, being injured by that, trying to re-enter society, and having that difficulty be something that their life is revolving around in an ongoing way into the future. So I thought that was a very powerful and interesting analogy to think about, and I wanted to invite you to say a little bit more about that. And I was also thinking about the very different ways in which those injuries were caused, right? In the first case, it's another individual or a group of, a rival group or something random even. In the second case, it's the state, and society at large in a way that, it just seems like it would be very devastating to try to reckon with. So I don't know if I just sort of wanted to think about that more because it seemed fruitful. So that was one just open invitation to comment if you had any further thoughts about that. And then the other thing I would like to hear you talk about, if you want to, is regarding the population of people that you studied and worked with. I was wondering what you think about their experience with school and the relationship between their experience with school and the educational system and the course of their life and the injuries that they encountered and have had to struggle with. People talk about a school to prison pipeline. Do you agree that there is such a thing, and if so, what does that mean? And what have you found sort of in thinking about that and working with the groups of people that you studied and worked with?
So, try to answer those questions together. First, I should say that, so in the community that I work in, it's actually like a 70% dropout rate, right? And so when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, let's just go back. So even the idea of the gang, right, or the idea of a dropout, what I'm really trying to get at is kind of allowing us to think critically about this idea of choice, this idea of responsibility, right? Even the term school dropout suggests that one day somebody decided, you know what, I'm not going to go to school anymore, right? But by the time it's a 70% dropout rate, it's not as if like people are making free choices like that. It's a confluence of factors that contributed to the reality that their statistical plight, right? In the same way, like the gang, it's not as if like people even say, one day I joined the gang. I mean, some people say that, but really the neighborhood itself is mapped on the gang territory. So if you live there and you would have to know how to navigate your way through the community, even if you are not officially in the gang. And if you're navigating your way through the community and somebody from another neighborhood confronts you and asks you where you're from, when you say the street that you're from, you might as well say the gang that controls that area, right? And so then you could be injured because of that, right? And so, in a way, I think in the analogy I was trying to make was that in both senses, I think that it's about more than an individual choice. And so that when we think about this distinction between retribution and vengeance that we were talking about earlier, right? To say that, somebody did something wrong so that the state can execute them as an act of retribution, it's not as simple as that, because the way these particular communities are policed, for example, the incident that mentioned earlier, in which a cop was shot, and then the 3-strike policy goes into effect, right? In a situation like that, it's as if the state is enacting vengeance on particular communities because of what one individual did in that instance, right? And so the way that communities are policed, the way that the criminal justice system is meted out, it's a disproportional way of thinking about punishment, right? Because again, like, joining the gang is not exactly a free choice in these circumstances. Dropping out of school is not exactly a free choice in these circumstances. And so the conditions under which one becomes criminal or criminalized are not exactly free choices. They're structured choices that funnel risk for particular forms because of, like, people's place in society, right? And so I think, again, it leads us to kind of critique the idea of seeing each incident as an example of right or wrong, or a choice that people made, instead of seeing it as a problem with the whole process, a problem with the kind of system that places people within this context.
Real quick.
Yeah.
Now, I make this decision then. So a lot of this type of thing, right? I want to get back to social sciences. Because like what I got out of what you just said just now, right? You're analyzing them, right? Social conditioning, right? Zero, sorry, community, you know? Now, my question is this here. Just go up in the air. Okay? The social sciences of academia don't one feel that they will see this too, or say, or express the same thing your expression to us in terms of like how you saw how things were, how people I wouldn't say forced, but they have like no choice to act or to function. But also there's a hidden dynamic that has shaped that. That's these societies, I assume, have academic out where they come from, knows that, and if they don't know that, then we should at least know it and expose it, a good job for them. But I think, well, for me, you see for me, okay, I'm so consumed my struggle, man, what I've been through, is to just take the best out of me just to make an attempt to do that, so, like I said, man, it's something that I see, I feel, and I also know that the social scientists are academics see too, Come on, man. You
Yeah.
see that.
Yeah.
Why aren't they saying what you're saying?
Yeah. I mean, I think that
All these people
there's,
are bored, some days their job,
I think that there's work being done. I mean, there's theories that try to seek to explain it, but I also think part of the problem is what was alluded to earlier, in the sense that this idea that race should be taken out of the equation, or not talking specifically about race. I think oftentimes that's a mistake. And it's a mistake that people make for strategic reasons or whatever reasons, right? Because if we go back to the courtroom, not just the Supreme Court, but the courtroom example, you take an example like Trayvon Martin case, in which the lawyers agreed that they won't explicitly mention race within the case, right? And so they didn't mention race. But oftentimes when we say that, okay, we're not explicitly mentioning race, or in the Supreme Court example where it's just too difficult to grapple with the legacy of something like race, there's a way in which race becomes more prominent because you're not explicitly talking about it. You can't identify it and look at the particular factors that are contributing to the way that a race is produced. So in the Trayvon Martin case, you're not explicitly mentioning race, but there's all sorts of ways that they're conjuring race, and conjuring this dangerous person who's wearing a hoodie, and the unspoken thing, the elephant in the room, is that he should be feared because he's black, right? He's a young black man, and therefore he should be feared. And the unspoken thing is that it's reasonable to fear young black men, right? But because you can't explicitly say that, it allows to go and become something that the jury accepts as part of the way that they adjudicate who's guilty, who's innocent, right?
So, I mean, let me just piggyback a little bit of that because, you know, a couple of things. You know, one thing is that in fact there's an indication that in a courtroom, it's much better to make race explicit. That it's when you don't that you're going to have some trouble, right? So that's one point. Another issue is, you know, a lot of work is being done on how you talk about seeking kind of reform or what have you, in criminal justice reform, and you know, one of the, you know, you know, what you want is you want people to understand systems and not kind of individual responsibility, because because the way you talk about something will push people into this individual responsibility. Well, he could have made a different choice, right?
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And that's where people want to go. So you have to find ways to talk about it that gets them to go into that structured place, right?
Yeah.
So there's real research on, you know, if you start to talk about the need for you talk about kind of a maze or a set of gears, or you use these different kinds of metaphors that conjure a system to people, it actually works better. The other thing I'll say about the system, you know, the fascinating thing about the Three Strikes bill is that the perpetrator and the victim that led to that legislation were both white. They were both white, but the net result had its greatest impact on communities of color. And that's due to a blindness, right? A failure to understand, to even, and that's because the people who were driving that discussion were the white legislators from those communities, right? And so you talk about a system, right? You know, so.
And that goes the same for the federal anti-crime acts in the 80s, 86 and 88.
Yeah.
That in terms of crack cocaine, and people weren't talking about race. Teresa, and then right here. Yes.
So, I guess to get back to the death penalty a little bit, and I'm thinking about public policy now too. I remember in the last day or two of Troy Davis's life, social media and my social media networks were like suddenly full of people who cared so much about the death penalty. And I was looking around just thinking, wow, I had no idea that all these people I knew felt strongly about abolishing the death penalty until this case came up. Many folks were doing more, just swirling on the internet. But it felt
Yeah, I think we're saying both. I mean, I'm saying both, but I'd love to hear what, let's start.
What,
Sabrina? Yeah.
you'd like to hear what else?
Yeah.
I mean, as far as, I just really feel like, as far as the death penalty is concerned, I just think that, oh, I'm not talking loud enough?
Yeah.
Okay. I just feel like as far as the death penalty is concerned, we just need to take a look at it and just realize that initiating the death penalty, as long as there's a human element surrounded by the death penalty, we're never going to get it right. You got to change it. I mean, at least if a person has a life sentence, you can fix that. But you can't fix the death penalty. You see what I'm saying? So that's the reason why I feel like we should change the policy, because the death penalty is designed to lock up a lot of black people, which is really crazy to me because I don't care anything about color. A person is a person, and I don't care if you're green, purple, orange. We're supposed to love each other, and I hate that we are always arguing and fighting over race. I mean, that is like in Washington, D.C., for instance, they're up there, the politicians, they can't get along. You know what I'm saying? And it's sad, really. It's really sad. I mean, how are we going to change anything if we're always fighting? So, I mean, I just think that my goal is to just keep talking about trying to change the death penalty and hoping to affect the change. I mean, that's my key goal,
Thank you. Lawrence?
All right.
This
No,
idea, either of you, David, Lawrence, this idea of citizen involvement in terms of transforming public policy through the vote, but then also beyond the vote in terms of sort of active citizenship, grassroots, just.
Yeah, I mean, no, my short answer is like, I agree it's not an either or. I think that being imaginative about how to connect what people are already doing in communities to centralized issues, right? And so I think that's the key, just figuring out how to make those connections in the moments in which those connections crystallize. Like, as David was mentioning, like the moment when the Mothers for Justice and Equality go to Ferguson is a key moment because that's the translation of the kind of ideology of injustice in different issues, right? And I think there's moments of interconnection and moments of nexus that can even help people, like politicize people, right? And then see why, voting is one amongst a range of political strategies that one has to do to accomplish a particular goal.
So again, I mean, there's so many pieces of my prepared remarks that I've neglected, but one of them was actually thinking about the question of citizenship, and we think about that a lot. So I talk about affecting policy. I talk about people whose voices are not heard, and typically we go to the vote place, right? So their voices aren't heard because in elections they don't win. But to us, citizenship there are two pieces of citizenship. It has nothing to do with voting. Citizenship has to do with being a member of and a participant in society. Right? And to the extent that people feel and in fact or are excluded from membership, their participation is going to be diminished. So people point to low voter turnout and criticize a lack of participation as if that's a lack of citizenship. Well, no, it doesn't go that way. There's a need for people to feel in serious and real ways that they are members of society, right? Before you can ask or expect them to participate by voting. Now, I think the Ferguson issue gives us the promise of some of both, right? Of starting to participate in ways that demand membership. Okay, and so I think it is an interesting kind of point in time where we are right now, where these things are actually perking up. Yeah. And the question on the Troy Davis thing, and it's really critical. The question is, how do we mobilize an effective and ongoing ways. So I'll tell you very personally, I mean, I sat with my son on the night that Troy Davis was executed, right? And we watched the news. I was expecting some phone calls from Georgia. You know, I was working with some people. And we got some word that there was a delay, remember, right? And I said to my son, okay, honey, you can go to sleep now, right? You can go to sleep now. And he went to sleep, and 2 hours later, they killed him. And I had to face getting up the next morning, my son having gone to sleep, you know, thinking that Troy Davis would be alive when he woke up, and telling him he was dead. And that, you know, there are, you know, I don't know what you know, but there are very few things that could be worse than that. Mm-hmm. Maybe losing your son is worse, right? But it brought home to me, in a way, the limits of this kind of internet flash, right? I mean, we got so far. It's almost like, you know, California. We got so close, right? So the issue, one of the things is, how do we provide the mechanisms and the means to kind of keep that kind of thing going? So those of us in the movement take Troy Davis's execution as a point of commitment, right? But, you know, there was the same kind of thing after Gina 6, right? I don't know if you remember. There was huge connectivity after Gina 6.
Yeah, 2005, 2006. All right, we're going to do one more question.
This is a very quick, this is more piping than anything else, but I think that it kind of breaks the response on if the cost of education in the United States no longer became a factor. I mean, I'm talking about full-fledged education, school, whatever, full-fledged education no longer became a factor to anybody, regardless of race or anything else. Okay, what impact do you think that would have on the incarceration rates in the United States?
It will make a difference. I think it will make a difference.
And that's a lot of trouble.
It will make a difference.
Well, I think,
That's for big issues, big problems, we can use solutions.
no, I think,
It will make a difference.
that's a great question in terms of what the impact. I think that one of the things that we're all facing, and I think sons and daughters of the 60s already knew this, but I think millennials don't, because millennials have a kind of unearned optimism about the United States and the world. And they're facing sort of colorblind racism, which makes them think that, you know, seeing race makes them racist, instead of understanding that all the racial disparities that we face are a product of institutional racism. One of the things, there's an article that went viral a few months ago by the Atlantic monthly writer Ta-Nehisi Coates, and it was called "The Case for Reparations." But it's a bigger article than that. It's really an essay about structural racism, white supremacy, you know, at the ground level. He does it through the narrative of a black man from Mississippi who transplanted to Chicago named Clyde Ross, who's about 90 years old now. He sort of follows what happened to Clyde Ross's family, both in Mississippi, where they owned land, but at times were cheated out of it, all the way to Chicago, where the promise of home ownership was denied to him, even though black people were allowed to purchase homes on contract, and if they missed the payment, the home got retaken. There was no equity. You had to pay every last bit, and it was double the value of the home. And so the people who were selling you the home were actually the owners of the home, but they listed themselves as sales agents. This happened all throughout, not just Chicago, but throughout the United States, right? And what that article did, a lot of my students and a lot of white students, I mean, this was viral. It was the most read thing on the Atlantic Monthly, like ever, right? And it was 15,000 words. It's a long article, The Case for Reparations. And he doesn't make a concrete case for reparations in that sense. He's just saying that, unlike what popular narratives suggest, American history is predicated on racial and economic exploitation of black bodies, from slavery, but to the present. That's the point of the argument, is that it never stopped. It took on different phases, convict lease, but it just never stopped. And even as he's writing, he's sort of astonished at all this, and he's taking all this great scholarship, but he boils it down to the general public. So fascinating, great read. And I think from that perspective, if you're armed with that perspective, then your question, and I love your question, but you understand that it sort of presupposes a kind of society and world that actually doesn't exist. Because one thing that David said that I would slightly tweak, there was a point he was talking about black lives and white lives and how the criminal justice system treats them. But really the criminal justice, and you see it from the ACLU report, the system and the society that we've set up is predicated on racial and economic exploitation of massive amounts of black people. Now that's different from saying that this is happening by accident. That's the whole thing. It's different from saying, hey, these institutions, because in the 50s and the 60s, at times people fought that. Certainly not Marxists and socialists, they didn't, but certainly genuine liberal, whites and blacks. Even Dr. King, you look at Dr. King's train of thought. There's a point, if you ask Dr. King in 1955, 56, 57, what's it gonna take? By 65, he's all over the place. He's talking about redistribution of wealth and things that certainly he had read about, but he didn't actually believe in. It's only once he sees Los Angeles and Watts, and he says he's on vacation. He comes from Puerto Rico, and he's like, damn, and everybody's screaming at him. Watts is Ferguson on steroids, right? 1965, August of 65, right? 34 people dead, millions in damage. Everybody's saying the end of the world is coming. You know, people, there's no online at that point, but people are writing in newspapers that it's Planet of the Apes, that all these black folks are, they're writing this down, they're writing this, right? So what we're saying is that the world you're imagining actually doesn't exist, but I like the question because I think most Americans imagine the world like that. After President Obama was elected, or Senator Obama was elected, so he was president-elect, first thing the Wall Street Journal said is that this is finally going to disprove this idea that what they called in the op-ed, this wonderful nation, that's what they said, this wonderful nation is inherently racist. They said that his narrative disproves that, right? So we still are caught up in that. The idea that, again, whether it's Troy Davis or Michael Brown or Trayvon Martin, that these are all accidents. These are all accidents on an otherwise healthy sort of society. Anybody?
I do think it does. You know, my immediate question would be: do you mean a Newton High School or a Boston school? Right. Which schools?
I mean, it's seriously a full education. I mean,
Right.
you know,
Right.
some people that actually afford a top education is.
No, so I mean, I'm saying that, but I go to that place because of thinking about these you know, these differentials. So every question kind of brings with it that qualification. But you know, I will say, Peniel, the interesting thing about Watts, you know, like I was a 14-year-old in LA at the time. The amazing thing about Watts was it ended at the border of Watts.
It ended what?
At the border of Watts. So people in Hollywood weren't worried, and they didn't have to. Right? We burned ourselves down. No, it's not funny.
That's the way you said it.
No, right? Race riots in the United States, you know, black people die, we burn down our own places.
Yeah.
You know,
It's the way you said it.
Whites riot, black people die, right? So there was, I mean, it's part of the, you know, it is part of the miracle of the system.
See, you laugh.
That's what happens. You know, Ferguson, right? You know, I mean, come on.
Isn't this disconnect that we have all part of this sort of like self-hatred of each other? Like, for instance, in gangs, like they don't, like you said, Watson didn't go beyond the borders, but like in gangs and the initiation, it's the same self-hatred of someone that's exactly like them, living in exactly the same neighborhood as them, as opposed to coming, joining together. didn't matter, such as this thing was saying, they let me go to school. No, well, separate but equal, but it wasn't.
Yeah.
They gave the black community all of the old dilapidated schools and then built brand new modern technology filled schools for the whites. So it's never been a level playing field. And it's a difficult job. You know, and I know. I worked 30 years with juveniles, worked in detention centers and prisons, to go in there and convince them how important education is, how important it is to communicate and help each other, like our parents did when I was growing up.
Yeah.
So, and I think, I don't know, my name is John Marcus, you know, and at 19, you know, I had this same system saying you went into a bar and murdered 4 people, or shot 3 people, murdered 3 who were totally unbeknownst to you. And I'm looking at the system saying you got to be drinking out of the toilet. I got a scholarship to go away to college and run some hurdles and try to become a professional athlete. I'm the first one in my family that got a college degree. I'm not about to throw that away and go and shoot somebody that I don't know about. I'm waiting to go away to school. Well, now, you were with Hurricane Carter, and we're willing to sacrifice your life in order to get in. So, but, if you just tell me, you just say that he was the murderer, we'll let you go. You know, but like the idiocy of just that statement is, had I done that, I would have assured both of our deaths.
Yeah.
We would have ended up with that. But they wanted to kill me. I looked at the death penalty, but I don't see the same camaraderie and harmoniousness in the black community that once existed
Yep.
in the 50s,
That's right.
in the 60s.
Well,
You know? And I don't know, if I work with a lot of guys like Mr. Ralph has, you know, and talking to these guys out games, and some of them able to turn around to see the import of family, of camaraderie, of brotherhood, we the same. You know, they're not going to do you any different than they do me. But I've also witnessed 2 kids, one white, one black, going to trial for the same sentence, ending up, the white kid gets probation, and the black kid goes to jail. So, I don't know, it's an arduous and extremely difficult process to try, you know, I love hearing you articulate this matter of going out into the community. Our community is more skeptical of us, another black person coming into the community saying we need to vote and not feeling connected to a society. So, man, you don't care about what I say. It don't matter anyway.
Yep.
You know, it don't matter. What show, you know, and if you have parents, you know, my mother went to the 3rd grade, but college was important to me. My dad went to the 8th grade, but college was important to me. And they made sure that you know, they didn't care about how many touchdowns I scored. They wanted to see my report card.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. That would be the last question. So people, thank you very much, Mr. Artis. Do you have anything to say?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just tie it back to what Peniel started with in terms of the policy issues, because I think it's there at the same time. Like, we can always look at what happened to somebody and think about how they understand that. But I think if we're looking at a broader picture, it has to do with these policy issues, and that's where we can have the intervention. In terms of the generational difference, one big difference is one of the issues in this panel is mass incarceration, right? Again, so when I'm talking about mass incarceration, I'm not just talking about like people being shipped off to prison. I'm talking about like, imagine an entire generation of adults removed from a community, and what does that do to those social relationships in the community, and how do then people try to understand social relationships in the absence of a generation of people, and gangs are a way to do that. But it's not as if, I think gangs at any given historical moment have also reflected what's going on at that moment. So when Dr. King came to Chicago, on the west side of Chicago, same community that I work with, gang members were marching in those same protests and for open housing, right? Because their families were affected by the fact that they couldn't buy houses in Chicago. So I think that, you know, the way that gang relationships manifest at any given historical moment also has to do with what's already going on in society. And part of what's going on now is that we're locking up a large amount of people, we're executing a large amount of people, and people have lost faith in societal institutions, which include school, right? Mm-hmm. So it's actually tied to this issue of like why people think that school is not really going to benefit their lives, because that's borne out by the facts, right? Yeah. They graduate from high school, it doesn't mean anything, they can't get a job. So to say that it's something wrong with them for thinking that is a failure on society's part, because they're actually right. It's like, if you graduate from certain high schools, particularly in Chicago, that doesn't actually mean much, right? Because they're so underfunded, because they lack so many resources. So in order for something like schools to be the answer, we would have to rethink what public education looks like, right?
And the big thing is it's society, because I understand what you're saying, and you know, people, there are great narratives historically about people who pull themselves up by bootstraps, including Oprah Winfrey, so many different people. They're a minority. The problem is, and David was talking about this in terms of citizenship and how do we define it. The reason why so many people over 65, and when you do social economic indicators, white, male, female, but depending on the income level, voting sparks up. So poor white people don't vote at the same level that middle-class white people vote. Middle-class white people don't vote at the same level as upper middle-class white people. And when you get to certain quintiles, there's certain groups, class-wise, who are voting at 90% clips in every election. And certain political scientists do that and say, hey, here's this county, and here are the people voting like this. They're voting like that because they feel entitled and empowered, okay? Black people historically in this country, I'm not talking about black elites, I'm not talking about a tiny percentage of black people who feel that way. Most black people, not only are they not taught to feel entitled and empowered, every single thing around them, even at a place like Tufts and Harvard, is reinforcing that you are actually not a full member of this society and this community. Every single thing. The reason why they have that I am black too at Harvard, and the kids here could have the same thing, is that they've been stopped. People have said to them, what are you doing here, right? That doesn't make you feel like you're part of a community, let alone poor people. By the time we're talking about poor people who, the school structure, the police, the lack of access, and certainly are there poor people who do heroic things and accomplish heroic things, from whether they're on Native American reservations or in urban so-called ghettos, which are really just poor black communities, or the Mississippi Delta. Absolutely, but when you look at the statistics, most don't. That's the whole thing. There's 43.2 million black people in the United States right now. 10% of them make $100,000 a year or more. 28% of them live below the poverty line. 40% of black children live below the poverty line, right? When we look at every single social economic indicator, they're disproportionately represented among negative social economic indicators, including the death penalty and mass incarceration, but also things like black women are dying of breast cancer at a disproportionate rate. There's thousands of black women who are missing in the United States that no one seems to care about. People aren't even trying to look for, right? They're victims of domestic violence, right? But they also, when we think about the mortgage crisis and the recession of 2008, right? They were also targeted, even black folks who were earning $100,000 and $200,000 a year. Wells Fargo was giving them so-called mud loans. Wells Fargo settled, right? You give the government a little settlement for giving the black people mud loans, adjustable rate mortgages that their white counterparts didn't get, right? So part of this, what you're saying, like, you know, why aren't black people feeling, it's not self-loathing, and it's not, sometimes people use that word self-hate, sort of gang violence, right? It's the society and the structures and the institutions in the society that are reinforcing, right, a very specific outcome for those groups of people, right? And then at the same time, when they try to do things like illegal underground economy, and remember, they're not the only ones who practice practice this, right? Bank of America practices it, Chase practices it, Citibank, right? And they pay fines. But when these folks try to do it, they are further criminalized and further marginalized, right? So part of this is how do we define citizenship? White kids at a much higher rate get passports. They feel like citizens of the world from jump, right? You get a little passport, you're 12, 13 years old. I knew black kids I grew up with in the south side of Jamaica, Queens, who never left the neighborhood. They never left Queens Village. They never left Left Rack City. They never left Queensbridge Projects, where I had friends from. They literally never left the projects. You could visit them in the projects, and I'd say, hey, come to my place. I'm living off of Springfield Boulevard. They said, I'm never leaving these projects. We're never leaving these projects. And that was the vision that they had, right? And that vision is reinforced by every single thing that they see around, right? So the culpability for not voting and not being participants, it's not on them, it's on us. It's not on them, it's on us, right? So once we figure that out, then we can get different structures and institutions to move towards them. Because the onus is not on them. The onus is on us to say, you can be part of this society. No one's going to pat you down and frisk you. No one's going to look for a gun. No one's going to say that you're accused, just like what happened to you. Accuse somebody who's going to college of a murder that they did not commit, right? No one's going to do that. But there's more people in jail now than when they sent you to jail. Over 2 million, yeah. So it's citizenship, and the only way, and this is the good thing about Tufts, is we talk about citizenship, we talk about all this stuff, but then some of us are trying to make the university and the institution live up to those obligations. It's the same thing we've talked about with the Constitution, Declaration of Independence. Martin Luther King Jr., right before he died, said that the greatness of America lies in the right to protest for right? And we have to remember, King, at the end, with the Poor People's Campaign, and we just have Bernard Lafayette, one of his lieutenants here, King at the end is saying he's still going to march, even though there's a court-ordered injunction saying he's not going to march, right? He says in Birmingham, we wouldn't let them turn us around, and you referred to Birmingham, spring of 1963. He said, we wouldn't let any dogs or German shepherds or hoses turn us around. He says in Memphis, right before he dies, we're not going to let any illegal court injunctions turn us around. And this is King. No one's decided it was illegal. He's saying he has decided it was illegal, and the people have decided it was illegal, right? Right? So there's what we're talking about is justice, right? But a more expansive vision of democracy and citizenship and justice than this country has ever known. That's what we're talking about. And we're trying to fulfill that through the work that we do. And what young black people need to know, just like young white kids need to know, is that this is possible, but they need to know what are the structures that are actually holding us all back. Because these structures are all around us. And again, that's why, it's like David said, by the time somebody doesn't feel like a citizen, of course they're not going to vote in the midterms for you, right? Of course they're not going to vote in a local election. Martha Coakley, all these signs, Charlie Baker, going into the ghetto when you need a vote. They want to feel like citizens. And if you go to Newton High School, did they build a $2 million high school? All this stuff. You feel from jump. You're 14 years old, $20 million high school, swimming pool, multiple tennis courts. Do you feel entitled and that you're a part of that society? Absolutely. Your parents are connected to all these boards, and they're telling you that you can be the best you can be. And they're telling you, don't even think about money. They said, go off to Haiti after graduating. Go off to Darfur. Help people out, and then come back, and you can take over this huge pharmaceutical company that I run, you know? Or this huge hedge fund that I run, right? We're going to do good, and then you can take that over. There's no counterpart in the African American community, or at times even Latino community. Poor people don't have that counterpart, yet we blame poor people and we say, well, you got Obamacare and you didn't vote. What's wrong with you? That's what we say. Even black people say that. That's the problem. And if we can meet them where they are, we're going to be in a much better position to change this whole society and reality for all of us. Yeah. What'd you say? You said Reuben said? Yeah. Okay. That we're asleep. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Thank you. This panel, thank you. Thank you for the engagement. This is great.